Next up, we're going to take a look at the fifth president of the United States, the last founding father president, James Monroe. And when I was opening this up, I was thinking Monroe was going to be a middle of the road president. I had not thought about James Monroe in a while. He's one that kind of comes up year of good feelings and that kind of thing. And it's one of the reasons I'm glad I'm doing the series that I'm doing and we're going in order. Because when you look at Monroe in context and what came before and came after, it's really impressive what he did for his 8 year period. Because this was not a time when it had to be as calm as it was. There were certainly a lot of things going on that could have caused a lot of things to be disruptive and problematic. And he found a way to avoid falling into a lot of messes that other presidents didn't. As an example, let's start with growth. Again, there were 5 criteria we're looking at: growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and was the country better or worse when he left. In terms of growth, he had one of the largest periods of physical land growth that any president had. I think people forget how much the Adams-Honest Treaty really expanded the size of the United States. Arguably, some of this land was already part of the Louisiana Purchase, but it was also a weird gray area. And being able to negotiate that not just with the British, but also with the Russians, who at this point had Alaska and were looking at taking a lot of the West Coast and had moved down the West Coast and made some claims on the West Coast. The Spanish had always claimed the entire West Coast. So this was a point of debate and discussion. And I don't think people realize the value of the Pacific Northwest in the way that we do now. But the Adams-Honest Treaty basically gave the United States access to, although debatably whether or not it was also a British thing, but it gave us access all the way out to Washington State, Oregon, huge areas. And over time, we did eventually make clear that those were our areas, make clear that that was a U.S. area, and that you have the lines that were drawn much later where it became more clear. But the treaty itself and the negotiation, with no bloodshed, with no fighting, with no war, incredibly impressive amount of land put in our country and put under our ledger. Needs to get credit for that. Florida was a little bit messier. You had the Seminole War before. We actually were able to acquire Florida from Spain, who was at this point more or less collapsing, which we'll get to when we get to international politics. But still, that's a major acquisition. The other area where growth occurred is more in terms of the 2 states added in the Missouri Compromise, with Missouri and Maine coming in. One is slave and one is free. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated when you're talking about his ledger. I'm almost thinking I should add a 6th criteria about internal, but I think I'll put that under better or worse. Maybe we'll talk about the Missouri Compromise later when we get to better or worse. It's a difficult discussion because something had to be decided. This was the original sin of America, having slave states and free states. The 3/5 Compromise was part of the Constitution for a reason, because this was never something we were able to easily work out. And I think this was a kick the can down the road kind of discussion, but it kicked the can down the road a long way. This really set a firm line that his predecessors had not been able or willing to set. You can argue he didn't set it where it should have been. You could argue that he really should have confronted it now, while it was possible we could have this done during the era of good feelings, where it would lead to a civil war, where we could theoretically sunset slavery as other countries tended to do. Now, those other countries also were shifting away from the type of slave-based colonialism where they were using more abusive practices toward labor and colonial powers with indigenous people. But at the same time, you can say Monroe didn't. He kicked the problem down the road a little bit with the Missouri Compromise. But I think that's not part of growth. In terms of growth, he did a really good job. In terms of finances, the Panic of 1819 is on his ledger. It's the first major economic slowdown, major recession that occurred in the new America. I'm not counting the Articles of Confederation problems. And, it's something that happened with his party's wishy-washy approaches to economics, but also not necessarily all his fault. Some of that was due to excessive speculation that the trade would continue when the Napoleonic Wars were going on and Europe was in need of resources, and trade was just booming in that way. I think there was over speculation. He's not the first president. He's not the only president we'll see later who's had these types of major downturns economically. But it is something that you have to count against him. During his time, the finances were not great for the country. I was reading something that I found interesting that you can argue that the Panic of 1819 drove a large number of immigrants, as far as people leaving America to go to Texas, and that might have been the foundation of what eventually became the Texas Revolution. I found that interesting, so I'm just saying it as a tidbit, not necessarily saying, oh, that's all Monroe's fault, but it's an interesting discussion of how bad the panic was that people were actually leaving the country, whereas up to this point, America had been a place people were escaping from Europe to get to. So that's on his ledger, but there also wasn't a huge amount of debt. He did a good job of balancing the budget while still spending on internal projects. So I'm not going to give him a huge downturn marks from there. So he's just not going to get, that's probably the one area as I'm looking at the five criteria that he had the weakness in. On the other hand, in terms of international politics, top notch. No wars, no major conflicts. The Adams-Onis Treaty, or Adams-Onis, however it's pronounced, I'm not sure, was an amazing treaty where we were able to, without bloodshed, secure rights to large pieces of land that made the greatly increased the country. Took arguably the control of American territories now from coast to coast. I mean, that was already part of the argument for the Louisiana Purchase, but now it was formalized, and the amount of land that was now clearly either American controlled or at least American British arguable, however you want to describe that treaty as an agreement, basically saying we all had access to that land and could use that land. Huge foreign policy negotiation. And he's most famous, of course, for the Monroe Doctrine, which a lot of people will say at the time, oh, okay, the Europeans kind of like nodded at that, but never took it seriously. It stayed and worked for a very long time. The Europeans tended to trend east, didn't really want to have the conflicts for whatever reason with us. Partially because Spain was collapsing and losing all its territories, and not interested in the heavy investments that would needed to stay out in Latin America. But that could have also been much messier if we had gotten into the affairs of Latin American countries and kind of tried to use what America did many times later with the proxy wars in South America to kind of help get the Spanish out. Monroe did a good job of staying out of that and not creating additional enemies and conflicts in Europe, while at the same time allowing the things to play out in such a way that South America and North America were kind of under the purview of the United States in a lot of ways with the Monroe document, and for us to stay out of European affairs. And I think the decision for us to stay out of European affairs served us very well in many things going forward. We didn't get pulled into a lot of colonial battles, which we very easily could have been, particularly once we get to the West Coast and some of the things going on there. So I think he deserves credit for that in terms of international politics. A lot of other people who were doing a lot of other things were not able to be successful in avoiding war, conflict, and that kind of things. Moving on, war and security. There was the Seminole War. That kind of falls on his ledger. I wouldn't necessarily count that. I mean, that's not on the same scale as like a War of 1812 or many of the other wars we're going to talk about later. But it was something that happened on his watch, and it was because he wasn't in control of his government. I mean, Jackson kind of did his own thing, which is something we will get to when we get to Andrew Jackson. So I don't want to go too far on that. But other than that, we stayed out of the European complexities. We stayed out of major conflicts. We were able to negotiate treaties rather than go to war. And the treaties, in the long run, if you look back, we came out ahead on all the treaties and negotiations. So where does that put us on the better or worse scale, which is the most important scale? This one, I would say we definitely came out better than we went in, but I do think there's some caveats that I would put into that. I do think the Missouri Compromise did not solve the problem. It kicked it down the road, and I think you can make that argument that it didn't improve things in the long run. I mean, I guess I would make the argument that it certainly made us not have to address the elephant in the room immediately, but it didn't solve anything, and you could say that it should have. I would say that the Panic of 1819 not really being was a negative that occurred during his watch that was problematic. I would say that in terms of political stability, and this is almost unfair to him because he came in with such a remarkable time of political stability, and during much of his time in office, he had remarkable political stability. But as he left office, the election that followed was the foundation for the splits in the American party system that proceed to this day. Um, it was the end of the single party centralized ruler, and maybe it was something that was unavoidable. Maybe Monroe shouldn't get any flack for this. As the last founding father, maybe we had just reached a point in maturity where you can't have that that everybody gets along, kumbaya, one party system. Maybe that's just not viable in the long term. But it was on his watch, at the end of his watch, that we entered into the campaign that came after the muckraking, which we'll kind of briefly discuss. But technically, all of that occurred. The fights between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson and all of that election occurred on his watch. So I think that's something that does fall to him, to not be able to lead his party, to not have that fight that became the foundational fight that I think eventually was the start of the road to the Civil War. Again, not putting that on Monroe. That's not something I'm putting on Monroe. But I think you also have to say the lines with regards to the Missouri Compromise and the instability of the party system that came after he left, that was the start of the path that eventually got to the Civil War. It could have been detoured many times. Many other presidents had to have huge failures for it to continue down that road, but it's not a coincidence the line the Missouri Compromise was drawn on was also the line of the Civil War. Again, not necessarily his fault, but I have difficulty arguing a very heavy better scale when such a big thing was left on him. So where does that put him? He's not above Washington, but he is definitely above Adams and Madison. So the question is he above Jefferson? I went back and forth on this. I'm going to put Jefferson second, and I'm going to put Monroe third. So it's going to be Washington number one, Jefferson number two, Monroe number three, Madison number four, and Adams number five.